On the morning of May 29, 1453, a 21-year-old sultan named Roman II rode through the gate of a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years. He was not the first enemy to try to take it. He was merely the first to succeed. He rode to the great church at the center of the city, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, completed in 537 AD and still, nearly a millennium later, the largest and most architecturally audacious building in the medieval world, and stood inside it for a long time. Then he ordered it converted into a mosque. The city was Constantinople, and the empire that had just ended was, by its own account, the Roman Empire. This requires adjustment. Most people who know any history at all have been told that Rome fell in 476 AD, when a Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. That event is real. The Western Roman Empire did end in 476, but the Eastern Roman Empire, the half centered on Constantinople, the half that had always been richer, more urbanized, more administratively coherent, did not end. It continued. It continued for nearly 1,000 more years, through plagues and conquests and civil wars and catastrophic territorial losses, contracting and sometimes expanding again, holding onto its Roman identity and its Roman legal traditions and its Roman title until that morning in 1453, when the last emperor died in the breach and the walls finally fell. The people who lived in this empire called themselves Romans. Their language was Greek. Their religion was Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Their laws were Roman laws. Their imperial title was Roman. The word Byzantine, the label that historians use today, was invented by later Western scholars, largely as a way of separating this Greek-speaking medieval state from the Roman Empire they believed had ended in the West. The Byzantines themselves never used it. They called themselves Romans until the very end. And when maimed Roman II took the city, he took the Roman title too, Caesari Rum, Caesar of the Romans. Understanding why this empire lasted so long, and why it finally fell, means going back to the beginning. When the Roman world divided in the late 4th century, the eastern half inherited geography that made survival far more likely than in the West. The eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Greece, Thrace, was the most economically productive zone of the ancient world. Egypt alone supplied enormous quantities of grain, papyrus, and tax revenue. The great commercial cities of the East, Alexandria and Antioch and Thessalonica, generated trade flows that dwarfed anything in the western provinces. And at the center of it all sat Constantinople, a city placed on a narrow peninsula where Europe meets Asia, surrounded on 3 sides by water, commanding the strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, reachable by land only from the west. Constantinople was, by deliberate design, the most defensible large city in the world. Its land walls, the Theodosian walls, completed in 413 AD under Emperor Theodosius Roman II, formed a double barrier of stone and brick nearly 6 kilometers long, backed by a moat, studded with towers placed at regular intervals. No army had breached these walls in the 1,000 years since their construction. The city behind them was connected to the sea routes that supplied it and dependent on no single road or bridge. You could blockade Constantinople more easily than you could assault it, and even blockades were difficult when the empire controlled the straits. The Eastern Empire also avoided the specific military crisis that destroyed the West. The Hunnic pressure that had displaced Gothic peoples into Roman territory in the 370 hit the Western Empire hardest. The East negotiated, paid tribute, and redirected threats westward. When Attila terrorized Western Europe in the 440s and 450, Constantinople paid him off with gold. The strategy was undignified. It worked. By the time the Western Empire was gone in 476, the East was still intact, still collecting taxes, still maintaining a professional bureaucracy, still fielding armies. It was smaller than the old undivided empire. It was also in many ways more focused and more capable. Justinian came to power in 527, and his story is one of the most dramatic in all of Byzantine history, partly because of what he accomplished and partly because of the scale at which his ambitions eventually collided with reality. Justinian was not born to the purple. He was a Latin speaker from the Balkans, a peasant's nephew raised to power by his uncle, the Emperor Justin I. He was relentlessly ambitious and possessed of a specific obsession: to reconquer the western provinces and restore the unified Roman Empire. He believed this was not merely politically desirable but divinely mandated. He had the energy, the money, and the generals to attempt it. He was also helped in all of this by his wife. Theodora was the daughter of a bearkeeper at the Constantinople hippodrome, which placed her at the very bottom of the Byzantine social hierarchy. She had worked as a performer and an actress, occupations which, in Byzantine law, were considered disreputable enough to disqualify their practitioners from marrying into the senatorial class. Justinian changed the law. He married her anyway. Theodora proved to be one of the most consequential figures in Byzantine history, not as a ceremonial consort but as a genuine political partner. In 532, 5 years into Justinian's reign, Constantinople exploded. The Nika riots, named for the victory chant the hippodrome's chariot-racing factions used, began as a dispute between rival fan groups and escalated within days into a full-scale urban revolt. Half the city was burning. 30,000 people may have died. Justinian, surrounded by fires and facing what looked like a successful coup, prepared to flee by ship. Theodora stopped him. According to the historian Procopius, who was present at court during the crisis, she told the assembled council that she would not leave, that she preferred the imperial purple as a burial shroud over a safe life in exile, and that anyone who wished to run could do so. Justinian stayed. His generals Belisarius and Mundus cleared the hippodrome with professional troops. The Nika riots were over within a day of Theodora's speech. After that, Justinian turned outward. His general Belisarius took North Africa from the Vandal kingdom in 533 in a campaign of remarkable speed. The Vandals, who had held North Africa for a century, were destroyed in 2 battles. Belisarius then moved to Italy, beginning a grinding war against the Ostrogoths that lasted 20 years and ended, eventually, in Byzantine victory. Southern Spain was briefly recovered. For a moment in the 550, the Mediterranean Sea was once again substantially Roman water. It could not last. The Italian campaigns had devastated the Italian peninsula. 20 years of grinding Gothic warfare destroyed the Ostrogoth kingdom, but also destroyed the cities, the agricultural infrastructure, and the civilian population that had sustained them. Justinian's successors could not hold Italy, North Africa, and Spain simultaneously, while also defending the Danube frontier and the Persian border. Within a generation of Justinian's death, the Lombards had taken most of Italy. What he had reconquered was being lost again. And then, in 541, something arrived that no general could fight and no wall could stop. The plague came to Egypt in the spring of 541, almost certainly carried in grain shipments from the interior of Africa. It moved through the trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean the same way grain and silk and papyrus moved, following the ships and the roads. By 542, it had reached Constantinople. The historian Procopius, who lived through the Constantinople outbreak, described the city collapsing under a weight of death it had no infrastructure to handle. Bodies piled in the streets. The grain supply broke down. Justinian himself contracted the disease. He survived, but he was weakened for months. The plague did not come in one wave and leave. It recurred over and over, in successive outbreaks separated by years or decades, for approximately 2 centuries. Modern analysis of ancient burial sites has confirmed what the medieval sources described. The pathogen was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death of the 14th century. The plague of Justinian was not a metaphor or a regional disaster. It was the first great pandemic of the medieval world. Its effects on the Byzantine Empire were profound and lasting. It destroyed the labor supply and tax base that Justinian's reconquest required. It reduced military manpower at precisely the moment that new threats were appearing on every frontier. It disrupted the trade networks that had made the Eastern Mediterranean prosperous. When Justinian died in 565, his great project of reunification was already fraying. The empire he left was militarily exhausted, financially strained, and fighting recurring waves of a disease that no one understood and no one could stop. His successors faced a compounding series of crises that he had left unsolved. The worst was still coming from the east. By the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was fighting for survival on two fronts simultaneously. In the west, Lombard invaders were taking chunks of Italy that the armies could not retake. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's great rival for 3 centuries, launched the most successful offensive it had ever mounted. Persian armies overran Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. By 619, the Persians held Alexandria. They had occupied Anatolia as far west as the Bosphorus, within sight of Constantinople's walls. They had captured the True Cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, from Jerusalem. The empire appeared to be collapsing. Into this crisis came Heraclius. Heraclius arrived in Constantinople in 610 by ship from Carthage, leading a rebellion against the Emperor Phocas, whose brutal misrule had paralyzed the empire's response to the Persian invasion. He executed Phocas, seized the throne, and spent the next several years in dangerous juggling, paying off the Avars in the north to buy time, reorganizing the army, melting down church treasures with the patriarch's blessing to fund a campaign. Then, in 622, he did something that no Byzantine emperor had done before. He personally led the army on a counteroffensive deep into Persian territory. For 6 years, Heraclius fought a campaign of extraordinary strategic complexity, avoiding the fortified Persian cities, striking at logistics and supply lines, drawing the Persian forces east while keeping the capital defended by its walls. The campaign climaxed at the Battle of Nineveh in 627, where Heraclius's forces destroyed the main Persian field army. The Sassanid court collapsed into succession crisis. By 628, a peace agreement had returned all the lost territories to Byzantium. The True Cross was recovered. It was one of the most remarkable military reversals in recorded history. Heraclius was celebrated across the Christian world as a hero who had saved civilization. The Sassanid Persian Empire, exhausted by the conflict, would collapse entirely within a generation, absorbed by the Arab expansion that was about to begin. 3 years after Heraclius's triumph, the Arab armies arrived at the Byzantine frontier. And they did not stop. The death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 released an explosive military and religious energy that neither the Byzantine Empire nor the Sassanid Empire had been prepared for. Arab tribal confederations, unified under the banner of Islam for the first time in history, moved north out of the Arabian Peninsula with a speed and ferocity that confounded both exhausted empires. At the Battle of Yarmouk in August 636, Arab forces met a larger Byzantine army in southern Syria and defeated it over several days of fighting. The defeat was not merely tactical. It opened the road to all of Syria, Palestine, and beyond. Damascus fell. Antioch fell. Jerusalem fell in 638, surrendering to the Caliph Umar in person. Egypt fell between 641 and 642. North Africa followed, with Carthage taken in 698. The territories that Heraclius had just spent a decade recovering from Persia were gone again, most of them permanently. Egypt, the empire's primary grain supply and one of its richest tax sources, was now an Islamic province. Syria, the most urbanized and commercially productive region of the empire, was gone. North Africa was gone. The Byzantine Empire, which at Justinian's death had stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia, was now reduced to Anatolia, Greece, parts of the Balkans, and scattered possessions in Italy and the Aegean. How did the empire survive at all? Partly because Constantinople's walls and its maritime position made the capital genuinely impregnable to the armies and fleets of the 7th century. 2 major Arab attempts to take Constantinople directly, a naval siege from 674 to 678, and another in 717 to 718, were both repelled, the latter with decisive help from Greek fire. a combustible liquid that burned on water and destroyed Arab fleets with terrifying efficiency. The exact composition of Greek fire was a closely guarded state secret, known only to the artisans who made it. Its formula has never been fully reconstructed, partly because the Byzantines reorganized themselves for a different kind of war. The old Roman provincial system was replaced by the theme system, in which military commanders called strategoi governed large districts, commanded local armies recruited from landholding soldiers, and collected local taxes. It was a more decentralized and more resilient structure than what it replaced, better suited to an empire that could no longer defend distant frontiers through centralized logistics. The Byzantines had stopped being what they had been under Justinian. They had become something else, a Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian military state, smaller and tougher, fighting for survival in a world that had transformed around them faster than anyone could have predicted. For the next 2 centuries, the Byzantine Empire contracted, defended, and endured. It lost ground slowly in Italy to the Lombards and then to the Franks. It fought repeated wars with Bulgaria in the north and the Arab Caliphate in the east. It suffered through the iconoclast controversy, a bitter theological dispute over whether religious images should be venerated or destroyed that divided the church, split the empire, and damaged relations with Western Christendom for generations. But it survived, and survival, for an empire that had lost 2/3 of its territory in 70 years, was itself a kind of achievement. The critical assets were the walls of Constantinople, the Greek fire that protected the straits, the theme system that gave the empire resilience without requiring large centralized armies, and the extraordinary administrative continuity that kept bureaucracy, law, and taxation functioning even through catastrophic military reversal. In the mid-9th century, something shifted. The iconoclast controversy was resolved. A new dynasty was about to begin, and the Byzantine Empire was about to experience the greatest period of expansion it had seen since Justinian. Basil I founded the Macedonian dynasty in 867 by murdering the Emperor Michael Roman III, who had made him co-emperor. The circumstances were squalid. The dynasty itself, over the following century and a half, produced the greatest military, cultural, and territorial expansion in Byzantine history since the 4th century. Under the Macedonian emperors, the empire pushed its borders outward again. Byzantine forces recaptured Cilicia, northern Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. They extended influence into Armenia and Georgia. They forced Bulgaria into a peace that recognized Byzantine dominance. They filled the Hagia Sophia with the gold mosaics, Christ, the emperors, the Virgin, whose fragments still shimmer in Istanbul today. Basil Roman II, who reigned from 976 to 1025, is the most celebrated Byzantine military commander of the Middle Period. His war against the Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel was a decade-long campaign of extraordinary brutality. It concluded in 1014 at the Battle of Claudion, where Byzantine forces captured approximately 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners. Basil blinded them all, every single one, leaving one eye in every 100th man, so he could lead the others home to Samuel. The Tsar looked at his returning army and died of a stroke. It is not a story that invites admiration. It does explain why Basil was called the Bulgar Slayer, and why no one seriously challenged Byzantine authority in the Balkans for a generation afterward. By the time Basil Roman II died in 1025, the Byzantine Empire's borders reached the Euphrates, the Upper Tigris and the Caucasus in the east, the Danube in the north, and the Adriatic in the west. Trade was booming. Art and theology and architecture were flourishing. Constantinople was, by almost any measure, the largest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world. The problem was that Basil Roman II died without an heir. The succession crisis that followed Basil Roman II's death in 1025 opened a period of instability that the Macedonian dynasty never fully recovered from. The next 3 decades brought a parade of weak emperors, court factions competing for control, and declining military investment. The great military aristocracy, provincial families who had commanded Byzantine armies for generations, clashed with the civilian bureaucrats of Constantinople. The frontier forces deteriorated. In 1071, two disasters struck in the same year. In Italy, Norman adventurers who had been carving a kingdom out of southern Italy and Sicily captured the Byzantine city of Bari, ending Byzantine control of Italy forever. It was a significant loss, but not an existential one. The battle at Manzikert, in eastern Anatolia in August of 1071, was different in kind. The Seljuk Turks, a nomadic confederation from Central Asia that had overrun the Abbasid Caliphate and was raiding deep into Byzantine Anatolia, met the Byzantine army under Emperor Romanos Roman IV Diogenes near the eastern frontier. The battle went badly. Romanos was captured by the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. It was the only time in Byzantine history that a reigning emperor was taken prisoner by an enemy in open battle. The immediate military defeat was painful but not irreversible. What followed it was. News of Romanos' capture triggered a coup in Constantinople. A rival emperor was installed. Romanos was returned, blinded in violation of the terms of his release, and died of his wounds. The empire spent the next 10 years in civil war while the frontier stood unguarded. During that decade, Seljuk Turkish nomadic populations flooded across the eastern frontier into Anatolia. They were not conquering in a conventional sense. They were settling. Farmers were displaced. Irrigation systems were abandoned. Grain production collapsed. Christian and Greek-speaking populations fled to the coasts and cities. The human geography of Anatolia, Greek-speaking and Christian for 1,000 years, began its long transformation. Anatolia was the Byzantine heartland. It provided most of the empire's soldiers and most of its tax revenue. Losing it was not like losing Egypt or Syria, distant provinces acquired by conquest. Losing Anatolia was losing the body of the state. The Byzantines would fight for 2 more centuries to recover pieces of the Anatolian coast and plateau. They would never recover the interior. The land was Turkish now, and it would remain Turkish. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza asking Pope Urban Roman II for help against the Seljuk Turks. Alexios wanted mercenary soldiers, professionals he could pay, command, and direct against specific objectives. What arrived the following year was the First Crusade. Approximately 100,000 Western European soldiers, most of them answering a religious call rather than a military contract, marching toward Jerusalem with a fervor that Alexios had not requested and could not fully control. Alexios was a skilled diplomat and administrator. He persuaded the crusade leaders to swear oaths of fealty and promise to return any recovered territory to the empire. Some promises were kept. Nicaea was returned. Most were not. The Crusader states established in Antioch and Jerusalem were independent Latin kingdoms, not Byzantine possessions. The First Crusade recovered the Holy Land for Western Christianity, not for Constantinople. Alexios nevertheless founded a dynasty that provided the empire with a century of relative stability. The Komnenian emperors, Alexios, John Roman II, Manuel I, were sophisticated rulers who navigated the new complexity of a world that now included Crusader states, Italian maritime republics, and fragmented Turkish principalities. They extended Byzantine influence into parts of Anatolia, maintained diplomatic relationships with Western powers, and kept the empire functional. But Alexios had made one decision in 1082 that would compound into catastrophe over generations. Desperate for Venetian naval support against the Normans, he gave Venice extraordinary trading privileges throughout the empire, lower customs duties than Byzantine merchants paid, free access to Byzantine ports, exemptions from taxes that applied to everyone else. Venice became the dominant commercial power in the eastern Mediterranean. Byzantine trade shrank in its own waters. When the relationship between Byzantium and Venice deteriorated over the following century, the consequences would be devastating. The Fourth Crusade is, in the history of medieval Christendom, one of the most stunning acts of institutional betrayal. The crusade was organized in 1198 with the objective of attacking Egypt, the commercial and military center of the Ayyubid Sultanate that controlled Jerusalem. It never reached Egypt. The Crusaders lacked the money to pay Venice for their transport. Venice, its commercial interests deeply enmeshed in the eastern Mediterranean, proposed a detour, first to Zara in Dalmatia, to help Venice recover a rebellious city. Then, following the opportunistic appearance of a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos who promised to pay all debts and reunify the Orthodox and Catholic churches, to Constantinople itself. The political story was complicated. The outcome was not. In April 1204, the Crusader and Venetian forces stormed Constantinople. The walls that had held against every enemy for 9 centuries were breached by armies flying the cross. 3 days of systematic looting followed. Churches were ransacked. The Hagia Sophia was desecrated. Libraries were emptied. The Hippodrome, decorated with bronze statues that had survived from antiquity, was stripped bare. The 4 great bronze horses from the Hippodrome were shipped to Venice, where replicas now stand on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. The originals are kept inside. The Crusader objective of liberating Jerusalem was abandoned completely. The original purpose of the crusade had been forgotten in the wealth of a Christian city. The Latin Empire of Constantinople that the Crusaders established lasted until 1261. It was a weak, chaotic state that never controlled more than a fraction of the territories it claimed. Byzantine successor governments survived at Nicaea in Anatolia, at Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, and in Epirus in northern Greece. In 1261, the Nicaean Emperor Michael Roman VIII Palaiologos recovered Constantinople in a surprise assault while most of the Latin garrison was away on a naval expedition. The restoration was real, but what was restored was a shadow of what had been destroyed. The libraries were gone. The bronze was gone. The population was a fraction of what it had been. The trade that had made Constantinople wealthy was now controlled by Venetian and Genoese merchants operating under privileges that the restored empire could not revoke without losing what little outside support it retained. The Palaiologos dynasty that Michael Roman VIII founded governed an empire that was, from its first day, already dying. The 14th century completed what the Fourth Crusade had begun. Serbia under Stefan Dušan expanded into Byzantine Macedonia, Thessaly, and Epirus in the 1340s. Dušan declared himself emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, absorbing Byzantine-speaking populations into a new Slavic empire that claimed the Byzantine inheritance. Byzantine territory shrank to Constantinople, Thrace, and the Peloponnese. The empire tore itself apart. A civil war between John V. Palaiologos and his father-in-law John V. I. Cantacuzenios from 1341 to 1354 consumed what remained of Byzantine military capacity and fiscal reserves. John V. I., in his struggle to hold power, invited Ottoman Turkish cavalry forces across the Bosphorus into Europe. They came. They saw the Balkans. They did not leave. The Black Death arrived in Constantinople in 1347, killing at least a third of the remaining population. The Ottoman state had emerged from a small principality in northwestern Anatolia in the late 13th century. By 1354, Ottoman forces held Gallipoli, their first foothold in Europe. Adrianople, deep in the Balkans, fell in 1369 and became the Ottoman capital. Bulgaria was absorbed. Serbia was broken at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. By the 1390, the Ottoman Empire controlled most of the Balkan Peninsula. Constantinople sat as an island inside Ottoman territory, trading on Ottoman sufferance, paying tribute, watching the empire around it vanish. Emperor Manuel Roman II Palaiologos traveled through Western Europe between 1400 and 1402, visiting Paris and London and the courts of France and England, personally asking Christian monarchs for military help. He was received with genuine honor. He received very little actual military assistance. The West watched the Byzantine Empire dying and mostly declined to intervene. 2 crusade armies tried to break Ottoman power and failed. At Nicopolis in 1396, a combined European force was destroyed by Sultan Bayezid I. At Varna in 1444, another crusade army was crushed by Murad Roman II. The West could not and would not commit the sustained military force that Constantinople needed. The final diplomatic gamble came at the Council of Florence in 1439, where Emperor John Roman VIII Palaiologos agreed to a formal reunion of the Orthodox and Catholic churches under papal authority, effectively submitting Eastern Christianity to Rome in exchange for a promised Western crusade. The agreement was signed. Most Orthodox clergy and laity in Constantinople rejected it with fury. The promised crusade was too small and too late. The religious union collapsed. By 1450, the Byzantine Empire consisted of Constantinople itself, the Peloponnese, and a handful of islands. It had no army capable of defending these. It had no money to hire one. The Emperor Constantine Roman XI Palaiologos had been crowned in 1449 without the traditional ceremony in Constantinople. The Patriarch refused to perform it because of the union with Rome, and without the formal recognition of any major Western power. Maimed Roman II became Sultan in 1451. He was 19 years old, well-educated, genuinely interested in ancient Greek and Roman history, fluent in 6 languages, and absolutely determined to finish what every previous sultan had begun. He spent his first 2 years in power preparing for the siege that would define his reign. The siege opened on April 6, 1453. Maimed brought an army that Byzantine and Ottoman sources estimate at between 60 and 80,000 soldiers, and a fleet of approximately 120 ships. The defenders of Constantinople numbered perhaps 7,000. Byzantine professionals, armed civilians, Genoese mercenaries under a captain named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, and a small Venetian naval contingent that happened to be in harbor. The disparity was enormous, but the walls were extraordinary, and Giustiniani was a professional of exceptional competence who organized the defense with energy and skill. The walls had a new problem they had never faced before: cannons. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had approached Constantinople first, offering to cast weapons for the city's defense. The Byzantine treasury had no money to pay him. Urban went to Maimed instead. The guns he cast for the Ottomans included the largest bronze cannons made to that point, the greatest of them reportedly 8 meters long, requiring 60 oxen and 400 men to move, firing stone balls weighing over 500 kilograms. It could only be fired 7 times per day before it needed to cool. But it fired, and the walls, which had repelled every army for 1,000 years, began to crack. For 53 days, the defenders held. Giustiniani's men worked through every night to repair in darkness what the cannons had broken during daylight. The Byzantine defenders moved along the walls themselves, patching breaches with rubble and timber, holding positions that should have been indefensible. Constantine Roman XI moved among his men, visible on the walls, directing repairs, offering encouragement, projecting the composure of a man who knew what was coming and had chosen not to show it. On the night of April 22, Maimed executed a maneuver that demonstrated both his engineering capability and his determination. Ottoman sailors transported a portion of the fleet overland, on wooden rails greased with animal fat, across the Galata Peninsula, and lowered them into the Golden Horn on the northern side of Constantinople, bypassing the chain barrier the Byzantines had stretched across the harbor. The city was now threatened from the north as well as the west. Giustiniani was wounded in the fighting in early May. The nature of the wound is debated. Some sources say it was minor, others that it was severe, but he left the walls. The loss of the Genoese commander visibly damaged the morale of the defense. On the night of May 28, Maimed ordered the final assault. It lasted through the darkness. The Ottoman forces attacked in waves, first irregular troops, then Anatolian soldiers, finally the elite Janissary infantry. The walls held. Giustiniani's mercenaries held. The Byzantines held. Somewhere in the early hours of May 29, a small gate called the Kirkaporta, in the Blascherny section of the walls on the northwestern corner, was found unlatched. The accounts differ on the details, whether it had simply been forgotten or whether someone opened it deliberately, whether one man entered or 50. What is agreed is that Ottoman soldiers passed through it, appeared inside the walls, and began shouting that the city was taken. The psychological effect was decisive. The defenders on the walls above began to look behind them. The defensive line broke. The walls were breached from the outside at almost the same moment. Constantine Roman XI learned that the walls had been entered. He removed his imperial regalia, the purple cloak, the gold insignia, so that his body could not be identified and displayed as a trophy. Then, according to the sources closest to the events, he charged into the oncoming Ottoman troops. He was last seen fighting in the breach. His body was never conclusively identified. On the morning of May 29, 1453, maimed Roman II entered Constantinople. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted and picked up a handful of earth from the ground, letting it fall over his turban in a gesture of humility and thanksgiving. He entered the great church. He reportedly looked up at the dome that had astonished every visitor for 900 years, and then spoke to the mullah who stood beside him. The first prayer was performed in the building that afternoon. The Hagia Sophia was a mosque. The Eastern Roman Empire had lasted, from the founding of Constantinople by Constantine I in 330 AD to its fall in 1453, for 1,123 years. It had outlasted the Western Roman Empire, measured from the traditional founding of Rome in 753 BC, by more than 2 centuries. In the weeks that followed the fall, Greek scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts. They brought texts by Aristotle and Plato, works of ancient Greek mathematics and medicine and drama, manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries when their Western equivalents had long since been lost to fire or neglect. Many of these scholars settled in Italian cities, in Florence, in Venice, in Rome. They taught ancient Greek to Italian humanists who had never read it. They made available texts that Western Europe had not seen in 1,000 years. The argument about how much of the Italian Renaissance was sparked by this Byzantine diaspora is genuinely complex, and historians debate the proportions. But the diaspora was real, and the manuscripts were real, and the humanists who read them wrote about the world differently afterward. Maimed Roman II himself did not simply discard the Roman inheritance. He commissioned portraits in the Italian Renaissance style. He consulted Greek scholars about ancient history. He had the works of Homer and Diogenes Laertius translated for his library. He took the title Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome, seriously enough to organize a campaign to take Rome itself, which he intended to complete his claim to the Roman inheritance. He died before it could happen. His successors ruled from Constantinople for 4 more centuries, governing an empire that incorporated Byzantine administrative structures into Ottoman practice. The word Byzantine, coined as a way of distinguishing the medieval Greek-speaking empire from the real Roman one, was never used by the people it described. They called themselves Romans because their laws said they were, because their imperial succession traced itself back through the centuries, because the identity had been maintained by institutional continuity across a span of time that makes most modern states look like recent improvisation. Constantine Roman XI Palaiologos was 49 years old when he died in the breach. He had been emperor for 4 years, ruling from a city that had been reduced to the capital of a city-state. He had no realistic prospect of holding Constantinople. He held it for 53 days against forces that outnumbered his defenders by at least 10 to 1, and then he died defending it rather than flee. The city endured. The empire did not. And somewhere between those two facts, in the space between the 1,000 years of survival and the Tuesday morning in May when it finally ended, lies the particular quality of Byzantium, that it adapted so intelligently, held on so long, survived so much of what should have destroyed it, and still, in the end, ran out of time. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years were breached not by a stronger enemy in some ultimate confrontation, but by the slow accumulation of things that could not be undone. A heartland lost, a treasury emptied, an alliance betrayed, a population thinned, a city that once held 500,000 people holding perhaps 50,000 by the end. The walls were the same walls. The city inside them was not the same city. Maimed Roman II, riding through the gate of Constantinople on that May morning, was not simply taking a city. He was closing a chapter that had opened when Constantine I dedicated his new capital on the Bosphorus and declared it the continuation of Rome. The chapter had lasted 11 centuries, through pandemic and conquest and internal collapse and miraculous recovery. It had produced Justinian's legal code, which still underlies European civil law. It had preserved the ancient Greek texts that fed the Renaissance. It had held the eastern frontier of Christendom for 1,000 years while the Western world rebuilt itself from the ruins of what Rome had been. And then, on a Tuesday in spring, it ended.